So in this part we'll focus on some of the teaching strategies that have been suggested by various authors and draw on some of the experience I've had in the classrooms to think about how we might teach around the concept of interpretation and narrative. So the first thing is to remember that many interpretations are written, and therefore there are some challenges involved in giving children access to the text. And indeed Foster's article is about teaching some quite long extracts, and obviously the more we get into interpretations that have been constructed by historians, the more we're getting into extended text, so the challenge of reading will be greater. So we can use some of the DARTs, the directed activities related to text, that we were talking about in the third long session in history, but there are also other conventions as well as textual conventions used in plays, films, songs, poems, cartoons, posters, whatever we might be using as our historical interpretation. And so it's important to remember whatever we do in relation to deconstructing a complicated text, we should also do in order to give children access to the deeper thinking that goes into constructing these other sources of information as well. So for example, if we're looking at film, we might want to teach children some of the conventions around film. We might want to teach them about basic camera angles. We might want to think about how filmmakers use lighting, how they construct sets, so that they can judge the product that they see on the screen in the context of the broader range of available ways that the director had to portray that. Because otherwise they will miss a lot of the visual clues that would really help you to come to a more meaningful interpretation of what's going on in that film as a source of information. And the same for plays and songs and political cartoons as well. We need to think about how we teach those conventions in the same way that we teach the conventions of writing. So here's an example for how we might deconstruct an extended text. So we put the historical text in the middle. This is I think just a page I selected at random from Darwin, but the key issue here isn't the text, it's the fact that you pick an historical document, or you pick an historian's interpretation, and this could be several pages. But as Foster suggests then, to make sure the children really think about what this text signifies and what the main ideas are, rather than leave it to chance, the teacher can produce a summary of the key ideas, and then the children simply have to put a link between the key idea and the piece of text they think has triggered the teacher to come to that conclusion. So in a way, this falls slightly short of asking children to interpret the text for themselves, but it gives them almost like a shortcut to start to deconstruct the text, to start to think about what's important within that historical interpretation. And the useful thing about that is that it helps the children read the text with a slightly through a slightly better informed lens. It helps them to understand different levels of the text, and that's largely because the teacher is providing a commentary, and all they have to do is link aspects of the commentary to the text to demonstrate that they understand the purpose and meaning of that commentary. And this reflects some of those matching activities suggested in the other reading that I've asked you to look at for this week from the book Learning to Teach History. This is another example from a teacher, this time using portraiture. And this teacher card refers to the use of portraiture almost as a double vision. So what's going on here is that they're using an image which has been constructed in 1834 of Lady Jane Grey's execution, which happened in 1554, and then the teacher starts with some very basic introductory questions. Name something you can see. How does the image make you feel? What tricks has the artist used to make you feel like that? So you can see that beginning to move from just straightforward spotting features of the picture to start to think about how an artist would go about deliberately constructing a picture. And then the teacher goes on to teach a little bit about Lady Jane Grey, who was married to Henry VIII and executed by him. But then instead of the whole focus being about her life, the inquiry that's being conducted in this history classroom is actually, why did the Victorians admire Lady Jane Grey? And that's why the teacher refers to it as a double vision, because this is not just an inquiry about Lady Jane Grey, this is an inquiry about the Victorians and how they constructed meaning and how they used history to reinforce their own notions about what was valuable in life or about what was virtuous. So another way in which we can draw on different forms of interpretation is we can use films. Obvious things to do with the film is to compare scenes in different films which cover similar contents. We can think about the different ways in which people choose to interpret events, or we can watch a film that's related to an event that we've studied closely and comment on how the filmmaker has represented people or events that we know something about. And that could lead to something as simple as a review. And we asked the students to review the film A for entertainment and B for historical accuracy. And in the literature, you'll see that people refer to the different purposes of historical interpretations, and that's important in how we judge something. So it's important to recognise if you're making a Hollywood film, that's a different kind of thing from making an historical documentary, and that's already a different kind of thing from writing a serious academic textbook. So by asking children to review the film from the perspective of how entertaining was it, which is its primary purpose, and then secondly how historically accurate was it, we're both enabling them to use different lenses to judge the film, and we're helping them to understand how these two things sit in some tension perhaps in the filmmaker's mind, because they are constructing a film not wanting to play entirely fast and loose with the history, but they need to interpret the history in a way which makes it most entertaining, and typically that might be losing some characters to keep the plot simple, or adding a little extra romantic twist, or making a battle a bit more romantic or a bit more clear cut, or all sorts of other small ways in which editing and interpretation questions lead you to make different judgments in the context of a film. So this enables us to think about the history that we're revising, that we know about through our studies, and it enables us to think about what kind of an artifact is constructed when we make a film, and it helps us then to distinguish between the different purposes of a film. We can also use textbooks in similar ways. We can compare two or more textbooks on the same topic. We can make that comparison between an old and a new textbook. We could compare textbooks and other forms of information, again, like the film, designed for different purposes, maybe designed by different organisations with different interests, but on the same topics. We can think about how those interpretations differ. And then once we've reviewed a range of textbooks, we can ask children to write their own textbook chapter, either for their class or for a younger group of children. This is a really good way to get children to understand that textbooks are a constructed account of a period, because they can produce their own account and then see that that's exactly the process the author has gone through. They have either had to write some more because there's some white space on the page and they need to fill it up, or they need to reduce their text because they've written too much, or they need to choose which sources go on the page because they haven't got enough room for all of them. So all of these decisions that children make help them to read text more critically, and to see the text, even in officially endorsed school textbooks, to see it as deliberately constructed by someone. And that's quite useful because it gets away from this notion that people often talk about in historical textbooks in schools, that the author kind of retreats from the text. The author of a school textbook largely presents information as though it were all essentially true, and doesn't make it clear when they're making an interpretation, or when they are making a value judgment or forwarding a particular argument. So we can do similar things with other interpretations like museum displays, and Gavin Baldwin in a recent article talks about this in relation to planning a trip to a museum and asking questions about identity. There's a really easy way in for children to ask themselves questions. If you go to your city museum, for example, who's represented here from our city, or more broadly from our country, and who's left out of that account of the kind of civic identity? What do we learn about those people's lives, and what's ignored or silenced? It's a really good way in to talk about recent demographic change, or to think about social diversity. You can look in lots of museums and think about Is there an equal balance here between men and women's lives, between children and adults' lives, between members of ethnic and religious minorities and the majority, between normal people and powerful people? So all of these questions can inform a more critical reading, and again, we're just helping children see beyond the surface and stop taking everything for granted and start to think that whatever we see in the museum has been put there by someone with a particular purpose in mind. They have made decisions, almost editorial decisions, about what goes in and what stays out. And through asking those kinds of questions and looking at displays with that kind of lens, we can ask ourselves, what does a museum say about the lives of people? What information's on the wall displays, and what questions are left unanswered? Then we can move on and think about creating our own museum display. So you could think about this as a project that would follow on from visiting a museum, but I've also constructed activities like this for the classroom, where we do this independently of whether we can get out to visit a site or not. So we can encourage students to construct their own museum displays, and we can either do that by doing it for real, or we can just plan and sketch out our plans and present them to one another. So a very simple lesson that we can use to focus on interpretation, how we construct accounts using evidence and interpreting evidence, could be we provide a large box full of images of artifacts from a particular period of time, and the children are asked to construct their museum exhibition by selecting a smaller number of pieces and then writing the information card. So they have to come up with some form of interpretation. And then you can kind of ramp up the level of teacher intervention with this. You could just leave children to this, to their own devices, or you could give them a particular briefing about audience, purpose, title, for example. So you could split the group into, the teaching group into 3 or 4. You could say one group, their brief is to appeal to school children. Another group, their brief is to appeal to specialist historians. Another group to appeal to the general audience. And by varying that, you can judge the extent to which children are able to make the correct editorial judgments and come to the correct interpretation. So we can switch the focus slightly, but it's a useful, creative way to really help children see the difference between interpreting individual artifacts and coming up with an overarching interpretation that attempts to make sense of those artifacts with a particular purpose. Obviously, we can open up topics to debate. We'll come back to look at debate later in the module, but one obvious way to focus on interpretations is to give children the same information but ask them to explore different viewpoints. I used to teach about the Great Irish Famine when I was teaching history in secondary school. You give children the same evidence and ask one group to consider the arguments that the Irish were largely to blame for their own terrible experiences in the famine, and the other group are arguing or looking for evidence to explain that the British government were to blame. Now, this can be problematic if it's just left at that, and some authors have pointed out that if we polarise and simplify debates, so there's either one or the other group who are to blame, then it sets up a false view of history. And it also creates this notion that the position you take in that debate is almost willful, that you have to ignore some evidence or willfully reinterpret other evidence to fit your political or ideological perspective. So we do need to follow up those activities. They're useful, I think, for opening up the potential for interpreting individual bits of evidence in different ways, but we can't just leave it there, because it does set up a false binary notion of it. An interpretation is either for or against, and then you just almost manipulate the data or the evidence to prove your point. So another way of looking at this kind of approach might be a lesson I used to teach with 15-year-olds around the Americans' bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. So I would provide them with evidence just to describe what happened, what the after effects were, and then ask the children to vote whether they would have supported the dropping of the bomb, whether they would not have supported it, or whether they are undecided. Then give them a set of documents which are all arguments for, a combination of historians' interpretations, American politicians' arguments, and other arguments for the dropping of the bomb, and then ask them to reconsider and recast their vote. Then give them a list of arguments against, and ask them to do the same. And then on the board, track how their vote changes. And generally in this lesson, what happens is initially more people are willing to vote for or against. And by the end of the lesson, most people are voting that they don't know, or they're not willing to vote for or against anymore, so they're undecided. And that leads us into a discussion about how much about how important it is that historians look at all of the evidence, weigh all of the evidence up, and that you can only come to a realistic judgment looking back on an event when you've done all of that analysis. That only trickling in partial evidence leads people to be too sure too quickly that they can take a position in that debate. So it's a similar kind of lesson in that we're using evidence, we're drip feeding it in different ways, and we're looking at it from different perspectives, but it's probably different in that it avoids setting up this false binary opposition between a for and against, and if anything it sows seeds of confusion, and it encourages students to think about the grey zone, about the subtlety of argument and interpretation, rather than thinking about binary black and white positions. So another way in which we can think about narrative, I suppose, rather than interpretation here, is first-hand accounts. And there is still a lot of history that we'll study in secondary school which is drawn from fairly recent political and social and economic changes, and so it's important to remember that we have access to people who actually have human stories to tell. So I've been in classrooms where people have interviewed elderly people about their lives as youngsters, about their memories of the Second World War, and this is really useful to really kind of bring home how close this history is, and to encourage children to think about different perspectives. And not all of those people's views on the war were reflected in the textbooks in the classroom, so it also opens up this interesting area of exploring the diversity of perceptions around historical events and periods. And now it's useful if you can get people into the classroom. Clearly it's also useful as a kind of homework task to set children to go and interview grandparents or people in the community. There's also some material available online, and obviously this completely depends on the kind of topic that you're looking at. But here I've put a link to Spielberg's sponsored film and video archive, which includes some Holocaust survivor testimony. And here there's this notion that the number of Holocaust survivors who are available to visit schools, talk about their lives, is dwindling as time goes on. They get older and they simply die of old age. And so this was an attempt to capture some of that material and make it more broadly available. What it means is that you can access this and use the power of individual narratives and storytelling about their lives to access historical learning. So the other thing that's important when we think about history teaching, and this picks up on the earlier point in the first part of the lecture about how historians tend to think about their writing almost as the first step in a dialogue. McGill says we as teachers need to use talk more explicitly in structuring opportunities to engage with history and historical accounts. So he says talk makes possible the restructuring of knowledge. So a creative history emerges when pupils are unable to discuss the whys and wherefores of the topic under consideration. So here's an example of how relatively simple adjustments to our teaching can lead to a greater depth in historical reasoning and thinking. And in this example, what McGill is really pointing up is that if we want children to come up with their own interpretations, or at least come up with interpretations that they will judge against the evidence they've been able to find, then we need to give them space to transform the evidence into interpretations. We can't just expect people to do that simply by sitting down and doing some writing. So how we move from the evidence to the interpretation is to give some explicit time aside for children to engage with thinking, to test out their ideas, to have responses from other people. That's a safe zone, if you like, to start to shape your thinking about a topic you've been studying, and to begin to see what kind of a narrative account can emerge from your analysis and your thinking. Now Husbands says, therefore, that when we come to writing, we should really think about what kind of writing we're expecting people to do. as we said, that to prepare to write you need to do some talking and thinking. He points out that most history teaching actually is around transactional report writing, which has a particular focus on comprehension and accurate description of information that's been gleaned from either reading the textbook or from reading historical sources. And he says that historians actually do three things when they're going about their work. They record, they organise and they present, and the kinds of writing they do in each of those phases is quite distinctive. So in the first phase, they're looking for relevant information, recording that and taking notes, but there's always a dialogue going on in their thinking, which leaks into the second phase, which is beginning to organise that information as they encounter it. So they're always looking for patterns, they're testing hypotheses in their thinking, they might be producing mind maps to see how relationships can be sustained between different collections of facts and ideas and artefacts. And then finally they move into a phase of presenting the kind of thinking that they have organised. That's when they start to think about developing a narrative, and that's when they think about the balance between an overarching story or a narrative, thick description, and kind of overt analysis. So there are these different things that are going on when you're presenting, and there's certainly very different forms of writing than when you're recording and organising. So he captures this. I'll talk about how he captures this in a moment. So here's an example of the kind of writing that might go on when we're doing our organising. And he says that if we want children to spend time organising their thoughts so that the writing has a purpose, we need to do this kind of activity, and then it makes sense that they have an opportunity to communicate their interpretation. But there's clearly a logical sequence here. We can't rush to write a historical essay until we've done our reasoning. So here is a mind map, and it would obviously be easier to produce a narrative account of the life and times and importance of Christopher Columbus once we've just organised our thoughts in something approaching this kind of method. So here's the model that I was going on to talk about with Chris Husbands. Across the top in the dark blue boxes, he summarises the process of doing history. He says the first phase is to clarify the task or our inquiry question and to collect data. The second phase is to interpret the data, but we're open and we're coming up with different possible interpretations here. Then we gather more data and we confirm our organisation, so we're refining, editing, adding information. We're kind of just confirming our hypotheses and moving towards greater certainty. Then we start to draw conclusions. We're arriving at personal judgments but based on the evidence. And then finally we move into the phase where we present our conclusions. And there's a purpose here which is about presenting and publishing conclusions normally to a particular audience. So the historian who writes a textbook for 12-year-olds is writing differently from the historian who's writing an academic monograph for colleagues. And he's also writing differently from the author who's writing for the Christmas bestseller market. Now, along the bottom, Husbands points out that there are different forms of writing that are associated with each of those stages. So the first one, clarifying a task and collecting data, the kinds of things we're asking children to do might be keeping journals, making notes, paraphrasing information they find, maybe producing surveys or forms or having kind of tabular formats for recording how many people say this, how many people say something else. When we come to interpret data, we might be moving into those more visual strategies that we just looked at, might be moving into timelines, flow charts, mind maps, and maybe also, as we start to explore possible interpretations, into short pieces presenting a point of view. Then when we're kind of recapitulating, if you like, and going back and expanding that data organising and gathering, then we're going back to reports, notes and tables as we were in the first chunk, but we're also beginning to produce summaries of evidence, overarching summaries. And then as we move into drawing conclusions, we might be going back into summaries, we might be moving tentatively into draft reports or draft essays, but knowing that there are opportunities to move text around, to rejig subheadings that divide up the overall account. And then finally we produce the final piece of work, which could be a report, an essay, it could be a play, a lecture to deliver to other students, it could be a letter, a poster, a labelled model. It could be charts to show the interrelationship between different factors. So it's useful to think about this so that we can have some clarity about the process of producing and working towards a final written account. Now, here's a huge list that I've taken from Husband's book and added to. I'm clearly not going to read through all of these, but I thought it was just worth including because it illustrates that there are so many different types of outcome as a history teacher that we could set. So as a task in the history classroom. So it's not good enough to say produce a written account at the end of every single project, because we could ask someone to produce a brief journal article. We could ask someone to produce a magazine aimed at a particular readership. We could ask them to produce a reference for an important individual in history. We could ask them to produce a straightforward story or a testimonial or a travel log. So all of these things are different forms of writing, and Husbands just says it's worth, when we're at the planning stage, in looking across this range and thinking about, is there an advantage of using one form of writing at one particular stage in that 5-stage planning cycle of an investigation? Because not just because it adds variety, but because it helps us really sharply focus on the purpose of each form of writing. So producing minutes that we might imagine come from a historical meeting is a way to get someone to summarise the complex issues in bullet point format, so that we can check they've understood it. Whereas asking someone to write a reference for an important general is a different thing, and that would enable us to make a judgment as to the extent to which children are able to evaluate the appropriate criteria for judging someone in that particular historical role at that particular time. So each form of writing leads you to a different focus, and we should determine the kind of focus that's useful in the classroom so that we can really push children to achieve as much and as clearly as they can. So here we come to the final point really, which is around making sure that our work in interpretations and the production of narratives is clear and has a clear purpose. So historical writing, generally speaking, has a purpose in an audience. It's not just written for some general catch-all purpose. If we want to improve the quality of students' writing, we should really clarify both the purpose in the audience for the tasks that we set in the classroom, and we should also then explore the conventions of writing in those traditions. We don't assume that people can write in any one of those 100+ styles. We should also give students time to build up their interpretations, which reflect their genuine attempts to engage with and make sense of the content they've studied, and we should not therefore move too quickly to copy historians' writing style, because that leads to a superficial aping of the style rather than a deeper engagement with the substance of history. So there are some of the references I've drawn on for this part of the lecture. Some of these issues are picked up in the final part, where I reflect on some of the principles being established by the 2 authors that I've asked you to look at for this week. So we'll revisit some of these key issues and then use them to set the scene for a context in the 3rd and final part of the lecture.